Hello and welcome to Adventures in AI, where the Insight Flow team members share things that have caught our attention over the past week and talk about our own experiences in the world of AI. If you want to get in touch with us about this or any other podcast, please email aiai@insightflow.io. That's aiai@insightflow.io, or find us on LinkedIn @insightflow-io or Twitter @InsightFlow1. I'm Giles.
I'm Rich.
And I'm Graham. And today we're going to carry on our theme of looking at the parts of business, the functions in business that could be affected by or entirely replaced by AI. Now, we've always said that just about all of the parts of business can be replaced by AI. But I think that there are some areas that people might be surprised by, or that there might be possibly some shock that functions that are seen today as being resolutely human and will never be replaced actually probably already are potentially able to be replaced. And we're going to look in particular at the functions around the head office, the senior management of business. Are we, the question goes, going to say goodbye to the executive or goodbye to even the CEO? Although we're not going to go quite into that one particularly at the moment. And so we're going to look through various functions provided by the head office and just talk about where the current state of AI is and perhaps who should be thinking about retraining. The first one we're going to look at is leadership itself. I think this is a really interesting one, and I think that if you start to look at what leadership is and how it works, I think you get into some quite interesting areas. So we've broken it down into three particular types of activities. So those are the inspiration, the motivation part of leadership, of actually getting teams to work together, bringing them together to work to a common cause. And then secondly, and linked to that very much, is the idea of vision, the leadership role of giving something that people can believe in, that they are recognizing as important and something that they're prepared to work for. And then thirdly, in the leadership function is the more practical aspect of team management. And that, of course, breaks down into a couple of areas. One, the hands-on human interactions. And in the second part of team management is possibly the more programmatic part, the idea that says that team management is as much about getting processes right as it is about giving vision and inspiration and motivation.
For me, I think a large part of leadership is actually it's finding your own style and finding out what works for you. And in terms of kind of leadership style, just because it works for somebody else doesn't necessarily mean it will work for you. And I think one of the challenges, firstly, when you step into leadership, but also as you go up the kind of ranks, it's kind of nobody teaches you how to do it necessarily. It's very uncommon for that to happen. So you've got to kind of find your own way a little bit. And I certainly found, as I was kind of going up the ranks, very, very often I would speak to friends, family, and colleagues as well, and just to have a conversation around actually how should I approach this problem and how should I deal with it? And if we think about how AI can play a part in that role, we've talked before about how AI is actually really good at acting as a coach. So if you think of it as it can certainly act as a kind of a leadership career coach for you, to help you to kind of to tackle those problems and to help you figure out your own style as well, which will be personal to you, and decide like kind of how you want to effectively manage your team to your own strength.
One of the really interesting things there, Rich, is you said nobody teaches leadership. Well, I mean, in fact, they do in some parts of business, and they certainly do in things like the military and what have you. But there's a whole library's worth of leadership books, the art of leadership in various flavors, in various forms, what have you. And I think one of the interesting things for me is the idea that you might put all of those books, copyright not included, of course, into a knowledge base. And would that end up with, and in our current level of technology, in our current level of the application of AI, would that end up with the mentor that you've talked about, but actually something that could start to be more proactive about but the other part of that, and I think it is a really interesting one across all of these areas we talk about, is and you said it, I talk through the problems I'm having, I talk through the challenges I'm facing, and I think that one of the bits that is incredibly important around leadership, and probably around many of the other areas we'll talk about, is problem setting, is actually defining the problem, is being able to articulate the problem. And I don't know, is AI something that helps us do that?
Yeah, I think there's almost a case to be made for taking a step even kind of further back and saying, well, let's so in an imaginary kind of organization that doesn't exist yet, could you imagine a situation where an AI was filtering all of the information that's going on in the organization and using that to make informed judgments or decisions, and then communicating that out in a way that inspired and led the organization, right? So I mean, obviously, it's not. I guess we're making an inherent kind of assumption that leadership is an inherently human thing, which I think it is. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it would be impossible to have an organization where an AI was actually leading it. But I think it'd be interesting just to explore a little bit as to, what might that look like and how would that work. So as well as, AI as mentor, and I think just kind of to answer the point you were making, Graham, if you've got an AI that's mentoring based on a full set of information that's available about what's going on in the organization, that actually you can see the AI being a much more useful mentor because it has the time to go off and actually properly research and understand what's going on, which is slightly different from just something that's absorbed all of the leadership manuals and, which I think all of us who've read them realize that you have to contextualize those in the organization that you're working in at best, and at worst ignore most of what they say. But so I think it's interesting then to say, well, what is it? What's the essence of leadership that an AI would have to be able to do in order to actually be the leader of an organization? So, at what point can I retire is basically the question.
I think you've made a really important point there. It's back to this idea of actually what gets measured gets managed. And it's like this idea that actually with AI, more things can get measured and analyzed and kind of provided to you. And that knowledge actually augments your leadership capabilities. Yeah,
I mean, it has some scary side effects potentially, because this person in this team is arguing with that person in this team, need to do something about it, depending on obviously the size of the organization and how much what the role of the CEO is within that organization. But yeah, I think I could see a world where a new type of organization could emerge where an AI was given a kind of objective and was told, right, pull in the resources that you need to meet this objective, both human and AI. At which point you essentially have an AI in a leadership role. It's making the decisions about what needs to be done next. It's giving humans and machines tasks to do. And the interesting thing about that model is the level of delegation that's required may be less than Hello Cat, maybe less than the level that's required in a human organization, because the AI can get through a lot more work in much less time. So actually, you could have a much, much flatter organization with an AI in charge than you can with a human in charge.
So that's just got me thinking, what's more scary, reporting to a robot or report?
But there's a couple of things there, aren't there? There's a thing that says if you are reporting to something that is entirely rational, is that something that, well, first of all, is that something that we would like as and I'm not entirely sure that I'm convinced that that is true. But the second part is that is it something that is necessarily better? I.e., that that when you're reporting into a system that is entirely rational, or is it basing its commentary and its responses on a slightly hidden agenda, in that it's working out its own path, whether that helps or hinders the thinking. I mean, I strongly suspect that the biggest barrier to AI replacing the leadership part of the head office function is the unwillingness of humans to interact with it in that way.
Yeah, I mean, and I do think this is where you could end up with a completely different form of governance for an organization, because actually, companies have charters, if you like, and they're set up with a charter of sorts, and articles of association and various other bits and pieces, which when those kind of things were originally thought up, they had quite a specific purpose. And I guess I kind of wonder if you made the decision-making process much more transparent. So with an AI in charge, it could go one of two ways. It could either end up being highly dictatorial, saying, right, you have to do this, then you do this, and there's no kind of, Brooks, no argument. Or it could enable a much more collaborative process and kind of be the coordinator of that. Now, I'm not 100% sure if that's leadership or just management, to be honest. But I could, you could see a world where you have a charter. I should say at this point, by the way, for the benefit of the pod, that Rich has a new cat who's desperate to join us. So if you
I'm really sorry.
If you see furry things, then that's why.
My desk is actually, it's 1.2 meters high. I'm standing at the moment, and she still managed to jump up somehow.
So a new and highly athletic cat, anyway. Yeah. So the point is that I think a lot of it depends, as with most interactions with particularly kind of Gen AI, most of it depends on how it's prompted and how it's set up, but also there's a kind of process that sits around that. So if you had a highly collaborative leadership role with the AI actually seeking and effectively doing what great leaders do, which is listening, and then making guiding based on what it learns from that, then it might end up being really good. It might be the best CEO ever, because it's not it's purely guided by the benefit of the company and not benefit of the self, and it'd be a lot cheaper than a lot of CEOs as well. So
Okay, so taking that leadership thing, I think the conclusion from that one, as we stand at the moment, is whilst it is possible that AI supports humans doing the leadership role, it is unlikely until quite a lot of cultural things change that we'll say goodbye to humans totally in that function.
Yeah, I think you might see some experiments in the short term of people going, right, I'm going to start an organization with an AI in charge. I think they'll be fringe.
Yeah.
So I don't think we'll see that as mainstream for a while.
Okay, so we move on to the next thing I laid out there, was just the areas around strategy and direction. And we've broken strategy and direction down into 4 sections. So there's the element of research and analysis, of finding out what the strategy definition, the thing that says, this is what we need to do to get to where we want to be, and partly also defining where we want to be, the ambition and goal setting, and then finally the measurement of how well we're doing as we move towards that. And I think, Giles, it's likely here that we'll see much more of AI in those types of functions.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is one where, actually it was fairly core, I guess, to the original idea for insight flow anyway, because that, particularly the kind of research analysis, and I guess at the other end, the metrics and measurement side of things, those parts are ones where there's a real opportunity for AI to automate, sort of switch on constant analysis processes and various other things. So you'd actually, eventually be able to say, okay, I've got a constant pulse of what's going on in my marketplace, and I've got a set of AIs that are measuring what's happening in my organization and in the marketplace and seeing how I'm doing comparatively and all that kind of thing. So I think that really does lend itself quite well to being heavily disrupted by AI. And I guess it kind of links back to the is McKinsey, are McKinsey's days numbered? Because you can see that organizations actually, if they've got that quality of analysis, then they may well be able to do more themselves. That said, I think the bit in the middle and the hardest part of strategy actually is not writing the strategy, it's not researching the strategy, it's not measuring what's going on, it's actually persuading the organization that they want to buy into it, and kind of keeping it going in the original intended direction. And that, to a certain extent, that comes back to the leadership thing that we've just been discussing, actually. So I think that part of strategy, you'd be really hard pushed to get AI to take over, other than potentially in a kind of policing role, where it goes, hang on, you can't do that because it doesn't align with the strategy. I should also say, by the way, just my own experiences in corporates is what tends to happen. You get a strategy, it gets a large budget associated with it, and then suddenly everything that existed beforehand that people wanted to get funded suddenly gets reimagined into the strategy. So the thing they're delivering hasn't really changed, but they're going for budget that is in existence within the strategy, and so suddenly, all of these pet projects become part of the strategy.
And yeah, I've always found, for a lot of the companies that I've worked with, and even kind of worked for and with, one of the really, really hard questions, and this is something we've talked before in the kind of AI replace McKinsey episode, it's what are people saying about my business, my product, the market? And it sounds really easy, but actually it can be very hard to find out what people are saying. And that's why clients that I used to work for really, really valued those kind of customer interviews that we used to do. So you can kind of really get an in-depth understanding of what people... And the thing is, people are saying things about your market and your product all the time. You just don't necessarily know it. The data's out there, and it's very, very hard for a single person or even a team to be able to go out there, kind of collate it and analyze it in kind of any reasonable time scale. And so, yeah, this is why I certainly think for strategy and direction, actually gathering all of that information that you need to then start to make decisions, I think it can help. And so that, I think then you've got the stage. So I'd split strategy into kind of 2 points, actually. It's like, what should I do? But then actually, how do I do it? And actually, the how do I do it is often more important than the what should I do. And I've got no shame in admitting that I found AI to be much better at planning things than I am. Kind of quite often, it's so detailed, I'll get to the point where I'll be like, oh, actually, that's too many steps. I can cut out kind of X, Y. But I find it really, really useful for kind of getting a really well-structured and organized plan set in place that considers all of the variables that you need to think about. Because I think kind of it's almost impossible to think of everything, especially first time, of the things that you need to consider as you're going through a strategy and how to implement it. And AI is really, really good at kind of finding those.
So here's a slightly philosophical question based on what you just said. So we were talking about, when we were talking about leadership earlier, we were talking about how you might have a leader that can basically plan everything, So my question is, do we need leadership if you've got good planning? Because if the AI can go, okay, I can tell you everything that needs to happen, then arguably you don't need leaders anymore. You just kind of have a bunch of drones that do the job. Now, I'm not saying it would be a fun place to work at all, but I think it's interesting just exploring that, because actually, the whole point, or not the whole point, but a large part of the point of a strategy in an organization is to set direction, and then the humans kind of coalesce around it. And so that combination of strategy and leadership combined, in my view at least, it is about bringing people along behind a direction that you're going in as an organization.
So this is, this is one of the great questions, but I think it highlights a difference between leadership and management. Yeah, producing hugely detailed plans is not leadership. It's also not strategy, by the way. Strategy is the vision of how we're going to accomplish something. The plan is the thing that is the execution part. And I think it's really useful to separate them out in general terms, in general business terms. It's useful to separate them out. But I think it's particularly useful to separate them out when you're talking about AI, because I think AI is undoubtedly very good at those sort of functional things. The idea that says, here is the plan and here are the activities associated with the plan. Or if it's the management part, here is your part in the plan. Here is what you are expected to do, and here is why you're doing it, and here's what you need to achieve. And those are somewhat functional, tactical operations. In both cases, the strategy piece and the leadership piece, I think, are much more about how humans think, how they operate, and appealing to humans. I mean, there's a couple of nice theories, and there's a theory of the servant leader, which I heartily endorse. I think it's an excellent way of thinking, that says that the leader's role is to serve the organization to make it better, and that they should be there to help people do their jobs better. And the idea of strategy, one of the things for me in strategy that feels like a very human role is the slightly, I suppose, lateral thinking. If you're talking within a strategic setting, what are our options are not necessarily drawn out of the previous activities that people have done. And I think some of the best strategies are those glimpses of a future that say, actually, we could be or do something completely different. And it feels to me that from the way that AI works, it's not very good at those leaps of lateral thinking that that humans are capable of. And Richard, you described it earlier. What an AI is very good at is looking at all the various options and then pulling in a plan that includes everything that needs to be considered. But that's not the same as creating new options or creating new ideas or creating different ways of looking at something, and at least putting them up for discussion. I think there is so to your,
I'm not sure I would necessarily agree that AI is not good at the more creative lateral thinking stuff. I think it's as good or bad as the prompt and the temperature, I would say, is the only other thing. You need to, if you want a kind of wacky out there idea, then whack the temperature right up, boil the model, and it'll give you something quite interesting. But yeah, I think you are right in terms of the rest of it.
So we move on then, and in fact, it actually falls very neatly out of what we've already covered quite large chunks of this. The idea of decision making. Now, the cynics might suggest that leadership head office functions are actually not very good at decisions already. So it feels as though there might be an easy part here. There is a two-sided bit to it. There's making the decision and making a decision that people buy into, because you can make a decision and if it's really rubbish, the teams just will ignore it and will wait until another decision comes along that changes it. And I think that's that sort of inertia, that slightly deliberate inertia, is a very common feature of many organizations. But again, if we look at decision making, it probably breaks down into sort of three phases. The first is evidence gathering. It's the stuff that I am going to use to help me make my decision. The second part of it then is setting up the options. Is a thing that says, what is it exactly that I am deciding? And the third part of it is a sort of planning stage that says, what does that mean? And it feels to me, and I think we've already talked about it in this podcast, it feels to me that AI is going to be very, very good at all of those three things.
Yeah, I think with evidence gathering, like I know I've spoken a little bit earlier about actually how it's really good at kind of gathering together large data sets. But what actually stands out to me is kind of something we touched on at the very start. It's this: if that evidence that you're gathering is based on your own employees and there's kind of an aura of Big Brother is watching around your organization, that's not necessarily going to be productive, and people will find ways to work outside that if they need to. So I certainly think that there's a balance to be found around evidence gathering and kind of getting you to that position of, okay, I can make decisions based on X, Y. And actually thinking about the human element of the second point there, the option setup of kind of what are the options available to me. I think you're right that AI is good at gathering options together, certainly things that have been done or talked about before. And I think I would kind of agree with both of you a little bit in terms of it is more difficult for AI to kind of think of things that are, I'd say, maybe more visionary. But with some work, you can start to kind of get there a little bit. But if I'm starting to think of actually what's the human element of that option setup, I've been in kind of plenty of meetings, board meetings, where there's an idea that kind of wants to be put into place and somebody says like, oh, Bob won't do it like that. And that kind of becomes the defining factor as to why you don't go with an option. And that is a very kind of human element to your option setup as well, that I think that last little bit that AI will struggle with it, and you need to understand the people that you will be working with to in order to put your plans into place and understanding how they operate. Now, I guess you could say, oh well, the AI could have an understanding of all of my employees, and kind of I suppose that they could, but then you're kind of going down that kind of Big Brother route again of having a dossier on absolutely everybody and kind of trying to predict how they will respond and what to do based on what they say or do or their feeling.
But I suspect quite strongly that actually some organisations will listen to you say that and say, well, actually, that feels like a really good idea. We want to be a data-led organisation, and having data on how our staff perform, both in terms of qualitatively, in terms of how well they do it, but also in a process way, and sort of what drives them and how they actually go about doing something. I suspect that some businesses will say, well, yeah, we should know that and we should do that. And if it's something that makes a profound difference on our decision making, then we absolutely should collect that data, whether it's for AI or not.
So I think there's a couple of interesting kind of angles on this, actually. So one is, because essentially what you're talking about, Rich, is the lack of data as an input to make a decision. And humans are quite good at filling the gaps in, or kind of having an intuitive sense of, oh, well, this person isn't going to deliver, or that person will, or, I know I can get these people behind this idea, but I can't get those people behind it. All of which would be, in theory, alien to an AI because it wouldn't have had access to the people. But if the AI is having conversations with all of those people. And I think this might be the path for organizations to go down, where they help the people who are underperforming by giving them AI mentors and AIs to do the boring work that they don't want to do, so that they can do the interesting work that they do want to do, right? So if you're using AI as a tool to improve a person's performance, and as a kind of co-worker or co-pilot, as the sort of common terminology, then that itself actually then gives you access to information that will help you, and also might de-risk some of the elements of things that wouldn't otherwise work. Now, I'm not sure, having said all that, whether it actually helps to guide an AI in making a decision, because effectively what you're saying there is, can the AI access a whole load of chats that it's had with a whole load of different people and use that to make a sensible decision about whether to go for option A or option B, when actually fundamentally the reason why you should be choosing option A or option B is because it's aligned to the strategic direction of the business. It is going to make you money or going to improve operations or whatever the decision that you're making is, and it's cost effective, and it's low risk, essentially. I mean, those are kind of usually the key criteria that organizations look at when they make decisions. But I think what's interesting is it's actually as you're pointing out, Rich, it's the non-rational parts of the decision-making process which often drive the decision-making process, which is, whether, I'm really interested in this, so I'm going that way, which sometimes it can feel like that if you're more junior in an organization, you go, what, we're going where, why? And, because it's a passion project or something else.
One of the interesting things about the military approach to decision making is that they make it highly processed and have consistent processes in place to make. So there's a thing called RDMP, which is rapid decision making processes, and it's a laid out series of steps that you go through, where the first question is what's happened, and the second question is how long do I have to react to it. And that being a really critical question, because if you have several weeks to react to something, then you go into the RDMP in much more detail. If you've got 30 seconds, then you literally skim through the top of it. But what it does is said, what's happened? How do I have to react to it? How does it affect our current plans? And as a result of that, what am I likely to have to change? And at each stage, it sort of takes you off into a subroutine that allows you to evaluate that. What information do I have? How do I have complete information? All those other questions that come out of that RDMP framework. And as I'm speaking and deliberately doing it, it feels to me that where you have a good process, a good framework of decision making, it feels likely that AI can help a great deal more because of those sort of subroutines. And AI, if you're chaining together agents in an AI flow, then you end up with that sort of thinking in place. And it does strike me as I'm saying this that one of the problems in many businesses is that there isn't actually a consistent way of making decisions, and that's one of the reasons why there are problems. Or one of the things that causes problems is that people make decisions in different ways, and those sets of context aren't actually terribly clear to the workers. So, it may be that here you can suggest that AI becomes incredibly useful if you become more focused on the framework processes behind decision making in this instance.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting area, actually, because if I just think back to, I've written tons of board papers for investment in my time, and writing those would have been a lot faster. So, I'm not sure whether it would have sped up the decision-making process itself, but certainly the level of effort and time that went into producing those things, I think you could cut that down to less than a day, maybe even hours rather than weeks. And some board papers I spent 6, 7, 8 weeks writing, and those are high stakes decisions because there are millions of pounds at stake, but at the same time, not particularly complicated decisions. But I do think the other thing, just as an observation, that as a general rule, the decisions that you put in front of people when you're kind of doing options analysis in that scenario will tend to be rigged in favor of the one that you want to go with. So, it's sort of like the proverbial shit sandwich, or maybe not quite that, but where you've got some very unpalatable things and slightly less unpalatable thing, and I've probably got it. It's obviously not a shit sandwich; it's the opposite. But that kind of idea of not having 3 good options, you actually have 2 bad options, and either because they're really expensive, high risk, and then you've got the one that you're proposing, which is better usually. So I'm not, that in itself rigs things in terms of the decision-making process. And the thing I learned very early on in doing that was, you can't, if you give people too many options, they won't make a decision. And if you make the options if you're too even-handed actually about the options, then they won't make a decision. And often not making a decision is worse than making the wrong one.
Yeah, well, that process of giving people less good options to highlight the good option is fraught with danger. I remember when I was with an agency and we were suggesting, for instance, creative solutions to something, we would present the one we really liked and thought worked brilliantly, along with 3 that we thought were just terrible. And we had to stop doing it because the number of times that one of the just terrible ones was selected and the whole team looked at each other and went, "Oh, right, okay." So you have to stop doing that. But I think
that's the difference between rational decision making and creative decision making.
Yeah, well, but I think one of the things you have to be very clear there about is that, as in quite a lot of the things we talk about, there are things that are just bad habits in businesses which produce bad results, and they will continue to produce bad results irrespective of whether AIs are involved or not. And for AI to work well, as exactly the same way for human controlled stuff to work well, you actually have to put in a good context. You have to put in a good framework. You have to put whatever the activity is in an appropriate context for it to work well. And I think it's kind of, it appears, the more we speak on these podcasts, the more often something like that comes along, whether it's, bad actors misusing AI on the one hand in one thing, or in this particular case, just bad frameworks that would allow bad frameworks which would produce bad products, irrespective of whether it's AI driven or human driven.
It's interesting because I think this points towards the amount of time it's going to take for organizations to fully embrace AI. Because actually, really, what we're talking about here is fundamentally rewiring the way organizations work to replace humans, actually, for a lot of the key roles. And I'm slightly reminded of the retail chain Timpson, who have a kind of, I think they have an upside down corporate culture, so they have almost nobody. They don't really have a head office, and all of the responsibility sits with their staff to make decisions. So their staff can take a day off when they want. They can choose to give someone a discount when they want, and there's just 2 rules they have to follow, and that's how the whole organisation is governed. Can't remember what the 2 rules are, unfortunately, but I think that if you think of the bureaucracy in some organisations, and I'm thinking kind of some because they're regulated like financial services, some just because organisations haven't really thought through how to organise themselves with less bureaucracy. They are probably going to start trying to automate some of those jobs using AI. But the problem is, if you're automating a bad system, then you'll find it harder anyway.
Okay, so I think our conclusions there in decision making is that given good frameworks, both humans and AI will make great decisions, but there are clearly parts of the process, evidence gathering, setting up options to a certain degree, and definitely the planning that comes out of decision making, where we say AI taking a major part. Now, in all these questions, the fun thing is, does this mean that the people who do these things disappear? The answer is probably not. Does it mean that the people who do these things have their functions and roles changed and possibly reduced in number? Then the answer is almost certainly yes, I think.
Well, I think one of the interesting things to look at there is what scale does it allow an organization to have in terms of the functions that we're talking about? So, what scale does it allow a leader to have that they wouldn't have been able to have previously? So how much can I as an individual leader achieve? How much as a strategist can I achieve? How much in terms of decision making can an organization achieve? And even to a certain extent, you can start to ask questions about how much experimentation can I achieve in a shorter amount of time that enables me to either in real life or in a kind of lab type environment experiment with a whole load of different options for my business and then use that to select the best one. Because ultimately a lot of the decisions are kind of, well, we don't know what we don't know, and we don't have the ability to simulate the future sufficiently well to be able to judge what we should do. And if AI allows you to start simulating the future more accurately and with a greater set of parameters, then maybe your decision-making process completely changes, because it's not, present 3 options to a human, it's present 100 options to an AI and get it to figure out which one the best is.
Yes, that's a really interesting thing. The idea that you can insert wargaming into decision making and leadership possibly in organizations strikes me as being a really interesting view on it, and not something that's commonly done at the moment for all sorts of time, financial constraints. So the final area that we thought we might look at is the much loved aspect of finance in head office. And is finance replaceable by HI? Is the finance team replaceable by HI? I'll start by saying we have said all along that at the moment, AI can't count very well. It's putting it somewhat simplistically, but AI and numbers is not a terribly good combination. So undoubtedly, some people in the finance team are relatively safe for the foreseeable future. All things change.
Just qualifying that to say generative AI, because there are forms of AI that are very good at numbers, but certainly in Gen AI, that's true.
So we thought in looking at the finance aspects of a head office, we thought we'd look at the 3 perhaps more human parts of it. So, and they are budgeting, investment choice, and business plan development. Now, budgeting is hilarious because I think that of all the head office functions, budgeting is in some ways the most human, despite its financial underlay, in that it is all about horse trading. It is all about a constant negotiation between the divisions of an organization and the senior to junior relationship within an organization, where everybody is fighting for a budget view for the next year that suits them, often at the expense of other parts of the organization. So looking at budgeting, do you guys see budgeting as something that can be, at the moment, can be AI driven, AI supported, or does AI not actually play a part in those sorts of human horse trading conversations?
I think there's going to be an arms race between the finance team who are trying to find reasons not to give the budget and the teams that are trying to find reasons to get the budget. So, you'll see the smart ones will be using research and other capabilities to actually start driving up what they should be, the amount of money that they should get. And the exact opposite will be true within the finance teams, where again they're using AI to come up with counter arguments. So you could just cut out the middlemen and kind of let the AIs argue it out between them.
Yeah, I think probably the biggest use for AI is slightly more downstream than kind of head office. For me, it would be when you're putting together your argument for your budget. I can see AI being incredibly useful. Now, as to whether that goes into a board meeting and they say, "Oh no, I don't like him. I like her," kind of the human element of it, where it doesn't matter what you said anyway. But I certainly think in terms of putting your case forward for exactly the same reasons we've said AI is good for strategy and decision making. It's kind of gathering that information, putting it together into kind of why you think that you need X amount of money, and putting that. I think as well, we've talked about AI's ability to take information from the past, very good, and analyze that and kind of come up with ideas. And I think budgeting by its very nature is a forward-looking, and so the reason I say that planning stage is really good for budgeting is because it's always a forward-looking process. And if you were to just kind of straight up ask an AI, okay, allocate my budgets for this year, firstly the AI would probably say, I need more information, because that's right. You can't just kind of base a lot of budgets on purely what you've done previously, because there's always kind of it's always evolving as the company goes forwards.
I think the other interesting thing about it is it's an ambition thing, as so a lot of the process that you go through is finance essentially challenging the ambition of different managers within the organization in terms of the budget that they get. And so at that level, it's very much a human process of, are you going to deliver this? Now, I could see that start to change if more and more teams are made up of humans and AI, then actually the ambition may start to matter slightly less, because the AI will just get the job done anyway. But if, as we are at the moment, I can't see this one being automated for some time.
I think it's worth pointing out, so that the thing that's kind of jumped out to me is that actually there are some very important financial decisions being made by computers, because we know that kind of up to 75% of stock market trading's algorithmic. So they do make important decisions, but I think, as is always the case with a lot of kind of automated processes, they work great until they don't. and for example, the post office scandal that's going around recently, I think there always needs to be that kind of that human oversight, even if it's just down to the level of, okay, who do I blame? I think that's going to be important, kind of ongoing.
So there is another area in this where I could see AI being quite useful potentially, because a lot of the time the stuff that gets documented around why did we allocate this amount of budget to this place, what was behind the decision, and I guess this kind of takes us on a little bit to talk about the investment case and kind of business plan development as well. There's always an element of, right, we're making a whole bunch of assumptions about income for the next financial year. We're making a bunch of assumptions about how much will be generated by different business units, a whole load of assumptions about the market and how that's going to behave in the next year. So, and I'm making an assumption we're talking about annual budgeting rather than quarterly or whatever, but the process is essentially the same. So if the AI can start to say, okay, here's the set of assumptions that this has been based on, then it may also start to give you a better framework for managing and adjusting your budgets on a more kind of nimble basis. So that's an area where I could see it starting to become more useful as a sort of active decision-making tool.
Yeah, actually, I think that kind of constant feedback strategy is one that AI would do really well. And actually, if you start thinking about if you're handing budgets out, the kind of the very obvious question that comes usually a month or a year down the line is, what's my return on investment from that budget? And there are some departments where it's really easy to get your return on investment. Oh, the sales team made 10 million this year. But there are lots of other budgets that need to go out that don't have that quantitative analysis in terms of return on investment. For example, has the culture in your organization been improved? Are your employees happier? There's lots of things like that kind of qualitative knowledge that's really hard to historically get information of. But with AI, because it can analyze kind of vast quantities of qualitative data and lots of different kinds, it can start to put together a picture of a return on investment that's not your traditional kind of, yes, okay, we've grown 5% this year, or whatever.
Yeah, there's definitely a risk if you try and quantify everything that you will miss the essence of the value of the organization.
Well, and you go back to that comment you made earlier, Rich, that if it's measured, it's managed, and that you fail to measure the intangibles. You know, what is the value to the team of the biscuits that you provide free in the kitchen? Well, and often much more than people would ever believe, as particularly around about a budgeting part of the year, where obviously that part of the sort of thing in the budget gets looked at. So we've talked quickly about investment, and it feels to me that you know, if you're thinking about investment in either capital or as acquisition type investment, then you actually run back into a decision making process where you're gathering evidence, where you're creating plans, where you're pulling existing information together and presenting it in a way that makes sense both for the business and for the people reading it. So we're saying around those things that, you know, as we've already said in the podcast, there's a huge impact that AI will have. And it's an interesting bit of you know, if you look at the corporate strategy team that have their investment analysts there for their M&A work, you know, can we see those types of functions reducing in organizations? Quite possibly, because I suspect that that's one area where improved productivity won't actually be the important thing. There's a sort of level of productivity because there's a sort of set amount of investment funds available, and that's where
I think
AI
that'll
might
depend
well
on
replace people.
I think that'll probably depend on the organization. Actually, some may go, we've got all these questions that we really want to answer, and just, you know, we haven't got the capacity. So they'll fill the, you know, available capacity, which, because it can do 10 times or 100 times more than it could before, they'll suddenly get all of the questions that they wanted to answer answered. Whether that will actually help the organization or not, I think, you know, will only be obvious in the kind of time that, well, once people have tried it out. But yeah, I think some organizations will go, brilliant, let's just learn loads more stuff. So
that's a quick trot through the question of, are we going to say goodbye head office? I think the answer is no, not completely. And as in so many of these questions, one of the things that comes out very clearly that when we're looking at the various head office functions, structuring your business and your business thinking well means that AI can help, but it can also help humans, and probably actually very similar types of structuring helps AI and humans. I think we see across the four areas we've talked about that AI can and will support enormously. And as Giles has just been talking about, whether that means that some people go or that businesses do more depends quite a lot on the businesses themselves. And I think at the end of the day, we can say a couple of things for sure. One, there will be change. Even with AI in its current state, there is an enormous possibility for quite significant change in how head offices work. I think we also can say fairly comprehensively that that will differ between organizations, even organizations of similar type. And that probably will be underwritten by a bigger process of just rethinking how businesses work themselves. Yeah, perhaps in 5 years' time, we can come back to this topic, and when people are more used to working with AI, more used to the ideas behind AI, and say, is it now time to say goodbye to the CEO? Perhaps not. That's it for this week. I've been
Giles.
And I've been Rich.